Hello, whispers in the dark viewers. In today's video, I will tell you our The Shadow story. You may feel scared while listening to this story. If you are ready for horror and mystery, let's start. David Carter sat hunched over his desk, the glow of his computer screen reflecting off his tired eyes. A graphic designer by trade, he used to find solace in the quiet hours spent perfecting his art. But now, those hours stretched endlessly, blurring into sleepless nights filled with dread. The nightmare always came. At first, it had been sporadic, a chilling vision that faded with the sunrise. But now it was relentless, haunting him every time he closed his eyes. The shadow, a figure so dark it seemed to absorb light. Its presence lingered in his mind long after he woke. "David, are you even listening to me?" Sarah's voice cut through the quiet hum of his office. He turned, startled, to see his wife standing in the doorway. Her soft brown eyes, usually warm and patient, were clouded with worry. "Sorry," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "I guess I zoned out." Sarah stepped closer, setting a steaming mug of tea on the desk. She leaned against the edge, studying his face. "You didn't sleep again, did you?" David hesitated, then sighed. "No. Same dream. Same thing." Her brow furrowed. "This isn't normal, David. You're not yourself lately. You're distracted, anxious. Maybe it's time to see someone about this." "I'm fine," he said quickly, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Sarah reached out, her hand brushing against his. "I'm worried about you." He gave her a faint smile. "I'll be okay. Just need to push through." But the truth was, he wasn't okay. Not even close. That night, David lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as Sarah slept beside him. He envied her peaceful expression, the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. For him, sleep had become a battleground, a place where the shadow waited. When it came, it was sudden, like being dropped into a cold abyss. The air was thick, suffocating, as he found himself standing in an endless void. The ground beneath him was damp and sticky, and the only sound was his own shallow breathing. Then, in the distance, it appeared. The shadow. It stood motionless, its form undefined yet imposing. It had no face, no features, but David could feel its eyes boring into him, stripping away every layer of his being. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it began to move, gliding closer without taking a step. David tried to run, but his legs felt heavy, as if the darkness itself was pulling him down. The shadow's presence grew overwhelming, its sheer weight pressing against his chest until he could barely breathe. "Stay away," he screamed, but the words were swallowed by the void. As the shadow loomed over him, a chilling whisper echoed in his ears. "David!" He woke with a start, gasping for air. The room was dark, but it felt wrong, as if the shadow had followed him into the waking world. Beside him, Sarah stirred but didn't wake. David clutched the sheets, his heart racing, as the whispers from the nightmare lingered in his mind. "David!" The morning sun cast long beams of light through the windows, but to David, the day felt no less oppressive than the night. He sat at the kitchen table, staring into the dark depths of his coffee cup. Across from him, Sarah leaned forward, her expression both concerned and determined. "You have to do something, David," she said, breaking the silence. "This isn't going away on its own." David ran a hand through his unkempt hair, the weight of exhaustion pulling at his shoulders. "You think I don't know that? I can barely function as it is." "Then let me help you," she insisted, reaching for his hand. Her touch was warm, grounding. "I found someone, Dr. Emily Foster. She specializes in dreams and sleep disorders. If anyone can help, it's her." David hesitated, his fingers tightening around the mug. The idea of sharing his nightmares with a stranger felt invasive, but the alternative was continuing this downward spiral. He glanced at Sarah, her eyes filled with an unwavering resolve. "Okay," he said finally, his voice low. "I'll go." The office of Dr. Emily Foster was tucked away on the second floor of an old brick building downtown. The waiting room was small but cozy, with muted colors and the faint scent of lavender. David fidgeted in his seat, his palms damp with sweat. David Carter? He looked up to see Dr. Foster standing at the doorway. She was in her early 40s, with kind eyes and an air of calm professionalism. "Come on in," she said with a gentle smile. The office itself was just as inviting. Plush chairs, warm lighting, and walls lined with bookshelves. David sat down, feeling both exposed and oddly safe. "So," Dr. Foster began, her voice soft but direct. "Sarah tells me you've been having recurring nightmares." David nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Yeah, for weeks now. The same one over and over. Can you tell me about it?" He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "It's hard to explain. I'm in this place, it feels empty but not like a normal emptiness. It's heavy, suffocating. There's this thing there. Call it the shadow." Dr. Foster tilted her head slightly, her pen hovering over a notebook. "The shadow. What does it look like?" "It doesn't," David said quickly. "I mean, it does, but it's more of a feeling. It's dark, like it's made of the absence of everything. And it's always watching me, even though it doesn't have eyes." "And how do you feel when you see it?" David swallowed hard. "Terrified, like it knows something about me. Something I don't want to know myself." Dr. Foster nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Recurring nightmares often symbolize unresolved fears or stress. The shadow might represent something in your life you're avoiding or afraid to confront. Have you been under a lot of pressure lately?" David gave a bitter laugh. "You could say that. Let's start small," she suggested. "When the shadow appears in your dream, how do you usually respond?" "I run. Or at least I try to. Running from it might be amplifying its power," she said gently. "Next time, if you can, try staying still. See what it does." David stared at her, the idea filling him with dread. "Stay still? You want me to let it catch me?" "It's just a dream," she said, her tone reassuring. "You're safe no matter what happens. Facing it might help you understand why it's there." As David left her office, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement. He shoved his hands into his pockets, trying to make sense of the session. Stay still? Face the shadow? The thought alone was enough to tighten his chest. The walk to his car was uneventful, but as he slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, a cold shiver ran down his spine. Glancing in the rearview mirror, he thought he saw movement, a flicker of darkness in the back seat. He spun around, heart racing, but the car was empty. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. The drive home was uneventful, but the unease lingered. When he stepped into the house, the usual warmth felt off. The air was heavy, and the familiar creaks of the floorboards sounded louder, sharper. As David sat on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen, a soft noise caught his attention. A faint whisper, just on the edge of hearing. He froze, his breath hitching. "David!" The voice was barely audible, but unmistakable. He turned his head sharply, eyes scanning the room. Nothing. And yet, as the shadows in the corner seemed to shift ever so slightly, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him home. The first time the shadow crossed into David's waking world, it was subtle. He was at his desk, staring at his laptop, trying to make sense of a client's demands. His vision blurred, and the familiar sensation of unease washed over him. The office lights flickered. David froze, his breath caught in his throat. The air felt heavy, thick, as though the room itself was holding its breath. From the corner of his eye, he saw it. A faint, undulating darkness shifting in the periphery. He turned his head sharply, but there was nothing there. Yet, the feeling of being watched lingered. The manifestations became more frequent in the days that followed. At first, they were fleeting. A shadow darting across the wall when no one else was home, the faint sound of whispers in the dead of night. But then, the shadow grew bolder. One night, as David showered, the lights flickered again. He reached out to steady himself against the wall, the steaming water cascading over his trembling body. Then he heard it. "David!" The voice was low, guttural, and impossibly close. He whipped his head around, slipping on the slick tile and crashing to the floor. The pain shot through his elbow as he hit the ground, but his eyes were locked on the figure standing beyond the fogged glass of the shower door. The shadow. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. David scrambled to his feet, throwing the door open only to find nothing. The bathroom was empty. He staggered out, clutching his arm, his breaths shallow and frantic. Sarah found him later that night, sitting in the dark living room, nursing his bruised elbow with a bag of frozen peas. "This has to stop, David," she said, her voice trembling with frustration and concern. "You're scaring me." "You think I'm not scared?" he snapped, louder than he intended. His outburst startled both of them, and he quickly softened his tone. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I don't know what's happening to me." She sat beside him, placing a hand on his knee. "It's getting worse. You need more help than Dr. Foster can give." He shook his head. "You don't understand. It's real. It's not just in my head anymore." "What does that even mean?" Sarah demanded, her patience wearing thin. "You're seeing things that aren't there. You're hurting yourself. I can't watch you destroy yourself like this, David." "I'm not crazy," he muttered, his voice trembling. Sarah stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Then prove it. Let someone help you before it's too late." She left the room, her footsteps echoing up the stairs, leaving David alone in the oppressive silence. That night, the shadow didn't wait for him to sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the temperature in the room dropped sharply. His breath misted in the air, and the familiar sense of dread gripped him. He turned his head toward the corner of the room, and there it was. The shadow loomed larger than before, its form writhing and shifting like smoke. For a moment it simply stood there, watching. Then it moved. David couldn't scream. His throat felt locked, his body frozen as the shadow rushed toward him. A crushing weight pinned him to the bed, his chest burning as though the air had been sucked from the room. Flashes of images burst through his mind, memories he had buried long ago. A child's cries, a darkened hallway, a hand gripping his arm too tightly. "No," he gasped, the word barely audible. "Not this." The shadow seemed to respond, its form pressing closer, its whispers seeping into his mind. "Remember." The pressure released suddenly, and David sat up, gasping for air. The room was empty, the oppressive darkness replaced by the soft glow of the moonlight streaming through the window. But his body ached as though he had been crushed, and the memories lingered, sharp and painful. Over the next few days, David's paranoia spiraled. He began avoiding mirrors, where he swore he saw the shadow lurking behind him. He jumped at every sound, every flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. Sarah tried to reach him, but her patience was fraying. "You need to tell me what's going on," she pleaded one evening, her voice cracking. "I don't know," he shouted, slamming his hand against the counter. "I don't know what's real anymore." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "You're shutting me out, David. You have to let me help you." But how could he explain what he didn't understand? The shadow wasn't just a dream anymore. It was a part of his reality. And as the buried memories clawed their way to the surface, he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was trying to tell him something. Something he wasn't ready to face. David sat alone in the dim glow of his desk lamp, clutching the notebook Dr. Foster had given him. She had suggested he write down his nightmares, anything he remembered, no matter how small, to help uncover what they meant. At first, he had resisted, but now, with his life unraveling, he felt he had no choice. His handwriting was shaky, the words barely legible as he scribbled furiously. Each line pulled at the edges of his memory, fragments of a long-buried truth surfacing in disjointed images. A dark hallway, the creak of a door, a shadow that wasn't just a shadow. David's pen stilled. He set the notebook aside, staring into the corner of the room where the shadow always seemed to linger. "I know you're there," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "Come out." At first, there was nothing but silence. Then the air grew heavy, cold, and the familiar whisper filled the room. "David." The shadow emerged, its form towering, shapeless yet undeniably human. It didn't move closer this time. It simply waited. That night, when sleep finally claimed him, David found himself back in the void. The crimson sky, the barren trees, it was all the same. But this time, he didn't run. The shadow stood before him, pulsating with a dark energy that made his skin crawl. David clenched his fists, forcing his trembling legs to remain still. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the emptiness. The shadow didn't reply. Instead, it stretched its arm forward, pointing to the ground. David looked down and froze. A small boy stood there, himself at 6 years old, eyes wide with terror. "No," David whispered, his heart racing. The scene around him shifted. The void gave way to a dimly lit house. David recognized it instantly, the home he had grown up in. The walls felt closer than they should, the air thick with an oppressive silence. The boy, his younger self, stood in the hallway, staring at a cracked door. From within came the sound of muffled voices, a man's low growl and a child's whimper. "No!" David yelled, trying to move, but his feet were rooted in place. "Don't go in there!" The boy didn't listen. He pushed the door open, revealing a shadowy figure standing over a small bed. The child on the bed, David's little brother, cried softly, his face turned away. David felt the memories rush back like a flood, each one more vivid than the last. His father's anger, the nights filled with fear, the helplessness of knowing he couldn't protect his brother. The shadow moved closer, towering over both Davids, the man and the boy. Its voice echoed, layered and haunting. "Remember, David, you left him." Tears streamed down David's face. "I didn't have a choice. I was a kid. I couldn't stop him." The shadow surged forward, enveloping him in darkness. David's chest tightened, the weight unbearable. He sank to his knees, the voices of his past swirling around him. His father's threats, his brother's cries, his own screams that no one answered. "Enough!" David shouted, his voice raw. "I can't change what happened, but I won't let it control me anymore." The darkness around him began to break apart, cracks of light cutting through the void. The shadow shrank back, its form losing shape, dissolving into nothingness. David stood, his breathing ragged, as the scene around him faded. The house, the hallway, his younger self. It all dissolved into a warm, golden light. David woke with a start, his body drenched in sweat. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel the shadow's oppressive presence. The room was still and quiet, the early morning light filtering through the curtains. Sarah stirred beside him, opening her eyes groggily. "David," she murmured. He turned to her, his expression soft. I think it's over." She sat up, searching his face. "What happened?" "I faced it," he said simply. "The shadow. It was my past. Everything I buried, everything I didn't want to remember. It was all there. And now," David exhaled deeply, "now I start to heal." The days that followed were quiet. The nightmares didn't return, though David occasionally felt the faintest flicker of unease when the house grew too quiet or the shadows in the corners seemed a little too deep. But he reminded himself that they were only echoes, not chains. As he sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Sarah joined him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Do you think it's really gone?" she asked. David hesitated, his eyes fixed on the fading light. "Maybe, or maybe it's just waiting." Sarah looked at him, her brow furrowed. "Waiting for what?" "For me to forget," he said quietly. "But I won't. Not this time." And as the shadows lengthened around them, David felt a strange mix of hope and unease. A reminder that the past could never truly be erased, only understood. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you liked our video. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like our video, and share your thoughts with us in the comments.